Hi everyone, my name is Kavita Gupta.
And I'm Vince Molinari.
Welcome to CNBC Africa's The Impact, powered by FinTech TV. Vince, we continue on this journey of dangerous women leading onwards. And today, it is so fascinating to have Cheryl Dorsey with us.
Well, it's an honor and privilege when we look at the work that Cheryl's done, the example that she's set, the way that she's jump-started so many things that grow and make a difference in the world.
I am a fan of her as soon as I heard that the first money for Michelle Obama's nonprofit was granted by her. And I'm like, that's it.
She had you at hello.
I feel like we talk a lot about African American women changing and having a different perspective when they do business, when they take up opportunities and everything. But now you're talking about somebody like Cheryl, who not only created and supported, most probably, Eco Green, which has been one of the biggest non-profit tech organization giving grants to startups. But her impact in Africa is also super, super, super fascinating.
Well, there's very few, I think, that have led the way Cheryl has and really created that bridge, right, from the continent back to the U.S. and having that flow and both capital, intellectual, financial capital, and really serving that leadership position.
Absolutely. Let's see what she has to say and share with our audiences.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome, everyone, to Dangerous Women Leading Onward, powered by FinTech TV. I'm Pat Mitchell, and today's guest is Cheryl L Dorsey, a trailblazer in social entrepreneurship movement and the president of Echoing Green, a global nonprofit that states as its mission, find the brightest leaders with the best ideas for innovation as early as possible, and then do everything we can to make sure they succeed. What a worthy mission. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you, Pat. I'm so honored to be here with you.
It's indeed a privilege to talk to you about this work. And before diving deep into what Echo Green is doing to change the world, I want to go back to how you made decisions on your own path to changing the world. You were an honor graduate of Harvard, a medical degree from Harvard Medical School, a master's degree from Harvard's Kennedy School, and you were clearly identified as one of the brightest leaders with the best ideas. And as such, you had a lot of options. You could have chosen very lucrative careers in many different arenas, and yet you chose yourself to become a social entrepreneur. What led you to this choice?
Pat, thank you so much for that question. I think it starts with, my childhood. I'm a African-American woman raised by two public school teachers in Baltimore, Maryland, who instilled, number one, the power of education to transform our lives, number one. Also, as an African-American in the United States that has struggled mightily with the tension between our founding ideals as a nation and the horrific struggle of white supremacy and white supremacist ideas that continue to plague our country, you can't help but sort of try to figure out your place in the world. All of us do it. We do it as women. We do it as people of color. We do it by class. And growing up, Pat, I got many signals saying that a little Black girl like me didn't matter, right? I think about one of my heroes as a young person, Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first African American woman to publish a book of poetry in this country. She was a formerly enslaved person, but she was denigrated terribly by many, including Thomas Jefferson, who could not believe that an African American woman had the wherewithal, the grace, the talent to produce a book of poetry. And sort of the threat that she imposed to ideals around white supremacy and sort of the enslavement of people who look like me was a real wake-up call about, what our country stood for and how we needed to think through how we were going to do better and ultimately live up to our ideals. And when I looked around me and saw all of the disparities, whether it was disparities in health outcomes or economic outcomes or educational outcomes, those were problems and structural inequities, Pat, from which I could not look away. And I felt I had a responsibility as a young person of color with a lot of gifts given to me and opportunities given to me to give something back. And so that led me to both Echoing Green and to the work of social justice and social innovation, which has been sort of the journey and path of my life.
And I do want to come back very much to the subject of the work you continue to do addressing racial and gender inequities. But to go back a bit more to the beginning of your story, you actually chose yourself to be a social entrepreneur, and that led you to Echoing Green. What was it about your experience at Echoing Green that convinced you that not only was this your path, but leading this organization would also be your path?
So, it's interesting. At Echoing Green, we often talk about, that moment of obligation. So what is that problem, that issue that quickens your pulse, that thing from which you cannot turn away, and it becomes your problem to own, not necessarily to solve, but yours to own. And it's that thing for which you will give everything. You sweat equity, your beautiful obsession that you will commit your life to trying to make progress towards. And for me, it was the issue of infant mortality. I was in medical school in the late 1980s at Harvard Medical School in Boston. And in the shadow of the world's best medical facilities, Black babies were dying at the rate of three times the rate of white babies, despite the proximity to these world-class facilities. And that just seemed wrong to me. And, Pat, you and I are both of a particular age where we read hard copies of the newspaper. And you always went immediately to the story above the fold because you knew that was important. It got prime real estate in particular periodicals. And in the late 1980s, the Boston Globe did a 5-part series called Birth and the Death Zones, where they looked at this problem of infant mortality amongst African-American babies. And I'll never forget the first of that 5-part series where a young African-American woman, who at the time was my age, was kneeling before the grave of the baby she had just buried. And that image is seared in my mind even today. I see her so clearly, and it just pains my soul because that baby should not have been lost to her, to us. And I felt that I could not turn away from that image, that issue. And with my mentor, my co-founder, I started a nonprofit organization called the Family Van to connect the dots between women like that, communities who needed resources, to the prodigious assets that existed within the Boston medical community. And Echoing Green was a newly minted fellowship program that absolutely took a chance on leaders like me. And that changed my life forever, Pat. So I became part of a community that believed in me before I truly believed in myself, that trusted me to do the work and wrapped its arms and its resources around me and provided me such leverage to make the Family Van a reality. And I saw the power of that model firsthand. I saw that power of a beloved, loving community, and it was something that I knew had to be available to more people. So here I am 20 plus years later, still in the struggle.
And 20 plus years later, Echoing Green has given that experience, that support to so many innovators and entrepreneurs and leaders all over the world. Just for those who may not be as familiar with how it works, how do you identify these best leaders with the best ideas?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, because it really is arduous, labor intensive work. Every year we source about 3,500 social business plans from 106 countries around the world, Pat. So our sourcing capability, that last mile distribution capability of getting into communities around the world, asking them to identify leaders for us that might want to apply for the Echo and Green Fellowship. It took us 20 plus years to build that talent pipeline infrastructure, right? Everything from collaborations with incredible local groups who know the percolating talent in their community. Turns out our fellows and alumni are our best ambassadors, right? They're so sticky as leaders. They are revered in their communities of people who have developed solutions to make their communities better. So they become the beacon which attracts others who want to be like them and do work like them. So in many ways, they are our best sales force to get out there and encourage people to apply. And increasingly, as social innovation has become not only an industry, but a field and a global social movement, honestly, Pat, because there are far too few of us who offer seed stage investing, we become a go-to resource for so many folks who've got ideas, who are Googling, where can I get my friends and family round of support? And there are just not enough places to go. So in terms of push-pull capability, people find us because there are just not enough of us out in the world to support early stage leaders.
And there are so many examples of early stage leaders who did go through Echo and Green and became transformative leaders. But can you share with us a couple of examples of this work or the leaders that stand out in your mind today?
Oh, yes, it's a wonderful collection of terrific leaders. There now have been about 900 Echo and Green Fellows that have been selected over the course of the past 35 years. They've got a footprint in up to 90 countries around the world. Obviously, we've got, as a New York-based organization, we've got a lot of Echo and Green Fellows based here in the United States. Probably some of our best-known fellows stateside are people like Michelle Obama. Most people would remember the First Lady of the United States, who received support from Echo and Green to start the Chicago office of a terrific public service organization called Public Allies, working with young people of color in Chicago. Most of the luminaries from the United States National Service Movement, the founders of Teach for America, City Year, Public Allies, Jumpstart, Citizen Schools, and so many others. Those leaders got their start through Echo and Green. We also have a wonderful, wonderful pipeline of talent coming from both the continent of Africa as well as from India. So wonderful social innovators like Kennedy Odede, founder of Shining Hope for Communities. I was just on a conference call with Kennedy on Friday talking about the extraordinary work he's doing in urban slums like Kibera and scaling his model across the continent. We also have worked with wonderful social innovators like Fred Swaniker and Chris Bradford from the African Leadership Academy that is working hard to build the next generation of ethical leadership on the continent of Africa through their wonderful boarding school in Johannesburg. Similarly, in India, Pat, we funded some terrific folks, including a young woman I was just emailing with the other day, Ajita Shah, who has started a wonderful company called Frontier Markets, which is working really hard to build strong rural marketplaces to connect rural customers to quality products and services. And she is an interesting example of how increasingly young social innovators are starting for-profit enterprises to help scale their solutions, recognizing that there's simply not enough philanthropic capital to help scale all of these wonderful ideas and solutions.
More with Cheryl Dorsey when we come back on The Impact.
And when you hear about these, and I'm familiar, as I hope many others listening to us are, with the transformative work of the leaders that you just named, and knowing that there are many, many more we haven't named, why is it still so difficult for innovators, new leaders with new ideas, to find the kind of support in the marketplace and in philanthropy that they need to take their ideas forward?
Such an important question, Pat. And I think there are a number of reasons. So I think, look, as human beings, we are naturally risk averse. That's why we have survived these thousands of years. And we build whole systems to wring out risk from the equation. And inherently, sort of backing early stage leaders with new ideas is inherently risky. So there are not enough risk tolerant funders like Echoing Green who recognize the potential return on investment if you place the right bet. That's number one. The second thing is the status quo perseveres for a reason. We don't like change. Those in power don't like to share or cede power. So in many ways, these social entrepreneurs who are speaking truth to power, trying to show us how the status quo does not work for enough of us, who does not provide enough equality of opportunity, is threatening to the status quo. So you actually have an incentive to keep those voices out. So I think it's difficult for these disruptive leaders to disrupt. There's a whole incentive structure built around that. And then I think last but not least, and Pat, you and I have talked about this, the power of proximity, right? The power of lived experience to drive solutions that fundamentally transform the lives of so many of us who are not given enough opportunity. And they look like us. They're women. They look like me. They're people of color. They look like those who are in particular castes that are locked out of conversations all the time. And that's an inherently difficult position to be in when whole structures are set up to marginalize you. So these are compounding factors that prevent so much of this talent from getting onto the playing field. And if we're going to build the kind of multicultural global society that we all want and need to live in, if we're going to survive and thrive into the 21st century, we've got to fundamentally change those inequitable structures.
And they are inequitable, as you suggest, across the board. Entrepreneurs and innovators of color certainly are receiving more challenges to getting investments as well as philanthropic dollars, as are women. I mean, an alarming percentage of capital goes to invest in women-led and women-founded companies. How do we address these remaining and sustaining barriers to change?
That is the question, isn't it, Pat? And we think really hard about that. So you're going to have to pull a lot of efforts because these structural inequities become systemic at some point and they become self-perpetuating. So sort of the work of unraveling, dismantling them requires a multifaceted, consistent, persistent approach. It's interesting. We did some research with our partners at the Bridgespan Group to sort of look at the depth of racial inequities in philanthropic funding. And we found that the three key drivers that prevented this capital from flowing to leaders of color, but which I think is applicable for women social entrepreneurs, those from marginalized and other marginalized groups. So I think it's a broadly applicable finding that you've got to go after three underlying factors, concepts around risk, bias, and power, right? So we've talked about the question of risk. How do you start to de-risk these investments? How do you open up capital streams? I think you do it in a couple of ways. One easy way is to invest in intermediaries like Echoing Green, who have figured out a way to build infrastructure to de-risk these investments and drive the kind of return on investment that philanthropists and other investors are looking for. I can say with confidence that Echoing Green Fellows, within 1 year of our investment, raised 14 times the amount of capital as unselected ventures. That's a real return on investment. So there are lots of intermediaries out there like us who have sort of helped create this capital marketplace and are doing really good jobs of deploying capital smartly.
Excellent advice. Not long ago, you were named in many sources and recognized globally for the ideas that Echoing Green and you yourself have put forward. One I particularly loved was you were named as in the top 50 of power and influence, and exercising or optimizing our individual power and our collective spheres of influence is what I consider dangerous because it is, as you say, a complete disruptor.
Yes.
And it puts forward the levers of change we need. So how do you define, do you think of yourself as a dangerous woman? How do you define dangerous in your own life and work?
Well, I so love it. And I thank you, Pat, because you are such a role model for so many of us. And when you sent me that T-shirt with dangerous women, I wear it proudly. And I think of you every time I wear that T-shirt. And, you know, it is so interesting, Pat, that I think, I don't think of it much. You know, I was raised again by two public school teachers who believed that you walk softly, but maybe you do carry a big stick. And it was never about talking about the work. It was about doing the work. And it was never about the recognition. It was about who are you helping today? Who are you helping tomorrow? And I think I just sort of carry that belief in service and humility with me. And I often feel that if I'm talking too much, I'm not doing enough. And I do believe that over time, the work speaks for itself. So I think that in this quest for justice and for change, sort of the example of keeping your head down, giving as much of myself as I'm able to give is the way that I'm supposed to show up in the world. But everything I do comes through the lessons of social movement leaders. And they're a continuum, right? You couldn't have a Martin without a Malcolm, right? They couldn't have done that work without Fannie Lou Hamer, without Ella Baker. They all needed to be there together, but they had to figure out where their skills, gifts, and talents fit along the movement architecture. And I think you are most dangerous where your head and your heart are aligned, where your skills and your gifts are uniquely placed to drive change. And I often say, I think my best and highest role is I'm a cultural translator, Pat. I'm very good at sitting at the nexus of very different worlds and diffusing between those worlds, trying to make the sum greater than the individual parts, right? So I spent my afternoons as a young medical student in the communities of Boston, but then I'd walk back across the T or the subway tracks back to the hallowed halls of Harvard Medical School, and I felt equally comfortable in both of those worlds. I now run a social innovation fund that is mostly focused on the intersection of innovation and justice, but I spend a great deal of my time sitting in offices on Wall Street, but diffusing between those two worlds. And I'm particularly good at that translation. So I recognize that that is my role to play. It's a small role, but it's my role. And I think that's when I'm most dangerous, when I'm left to do it. But it's a small part of a greater whole for sure.
I think you have just redefined dangerous even for me, because being a cultural translator just might be one of the most dangerous things we could be, to walk, as you say, in both worlds, to stay proximate to the work that matters. Thank you, Cheryl Dorsey, for your life, your work, your passion, for all that you do to create transformative change in the world. Thank you for sharing all of that with us today.
Pat, my great honor to be with you. Thank you so much.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us and spending your time today with today's Dangerous Woman. Remember, we can't be dangerous from the sidelines. Our purpose with this program is to encourage you to step up, stand up, speak up, and show up. That's how we move onward toward a more just, equitable, and sustainable world.